Hello everyone, I'm David D. Hilster, President of the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. During the past 2 years, we have used annual fundraising drives in order to keep our organization's presence alive and well on the internet. But first, I want to thank everyone who pays their annual memberships through our automatic online system. Your support is vital and provides us with important funds to keep the CMPS afloat. This year, we will be implementing several changes to our online system. Several to save money and lower our annual expenses, and another to better our discussion platform. Our goal this year is $2,000, and I hope we can reach that goal. Whatever amount you can donate, it is greatly appreciated and needed. Your membership and donations are vital to keeping our online community of critical thinkers alive and well. Thank you, and keep up the amazing work that is driving science forward.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another Saturday session of John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. If you could just hold on a moment, I've got to check, make sure the sound's coming through. Okay, thank you. I think the sound's coming through. At least I can hear it, if nobody else can. So, today's little talk will be about the relativity principle. And the relativity principle is the foundation of Einstein's relativity. And unfortunately, it's wrong. So, everything that's been built up from that is wrong, unfortunately. So, that's quite a shock. Will be quite a shock to many people, and many people probably wouldn't want to believe that, but as we go through it, I'll point out what's wrong. If I can just call up the chat again on my sidebar so I can see what's going on. So it doesn't look like we've got that many people here today, as far as I can tell, which is pretty sad, isn't it? Bit sad for such an important subject as this about the relativity principle. So maybe people are prejudiced against the idea that it could be wrong. But anyway, next slide. So this talk is going to be split into two parts, part one and a part two. And part two goes into more details. It comes at things from a different direction. And I only need to do part two if some things are not clear from part one. So ideally, I finish the talk at part one. And at part one, we could have a discussion. And if there's no problems, we could then go on to part two. But part two basically goes over the same sort of stuff again. So I've got a comment here. Let's see if I can keep up the chat with everything. Good morning to all, and hi Roger. Hi from Roger. Hi. So thank you for saying hi to me. Let's see. Down for that. Next slide. So we're going on to part one. So what I'm basically doing is I'm picking up from previous talks. It should be sort of an introduction to this. It's sort of a build up from what I've been talking about on previous talks, explaining about the difference between metaphysics and physics, and trying to explain to us the general outline of what Einstein's relativity is about and the problems we face with it. And as I was saying earlier, that Einstein's relativity is based upon this idea of the relativity principle. So now we get into the core of the issue, which is that the relativity principle that Einstein's been building upon is wrong. And he's been building on it, and everybody's been in mainstream physics at least been going by this relativity principle from Einstein. So as I pointed out in other talks, experiments can be interpreted from Einstein's special relativity and are supposed to be also supposed to be interpretable from Lorentz ether theory. So that's what the mainstream thinks. You're supposed to be able to interpret experiments from the two different theories. And you could start digging into special relativity and start saying, oh, there's something's wrong with it. But that's the point of view of the mainstream. They like to believe special relativity. Now, in special relativity, it's usually supposed to be that from the relativity principle, there is no ether frame. And that is in conflict with the Lorentz theory that assumes an ether frame. So straight away, you've got a conflict. You've got two theories, special relativity and Lorentz ether theory, and one's being interpreted as saying there's no ether, and the other is being interpreted as there is an ether. So you've got a conflict over whether there is an ether or not. Now, if you go back to Einstein's writings, he doesn't seem to say there's no ether. That in 1905, he seems to be saying it's superfluous. So really, this claim that there's no ether is false, and that's from most of the people in the mainstream. They say there's no ether, but really you should be, oh, there is an ether, but you can't really detect it. So from the point of view from the Lorentz theory, which has an ether, it wants the relativity principle amended. And i.e. special relativity principle is wrong and need to replace it by another relativity principle that explicitly admits an ether. So the existing relativity principle from Einstein, it gets interpreted as saying there's no ether, and that can't be true because Lorentz theory is saying there is an ether. So the Lorentz theory is saying you've got to amend that relativity principle. Next. So as per previous talks, I rely heavily on artificial intelligence, and with my preferred AI as being ChatGPT, because I get more sensible discussions with it. There are many reasons for this, but consider the question: if I want to investigate issues not covered by the special relativity literature, and particularly it doesn't really go into enough detail about Lorentz theory in most cases, and so where else can I go to other than say something like AI? I choose AI because it seems to collect relevant information. There's a vast amount of information on physics on the internet, and it seems to be collecting the information which is relevant to what I want to talk about. So, and it attempts to put it into a coherent form, all this information out there, but doesn't necessarily succeed at doing that. But most of the time, I think it's coherent. Well, at least been coherent when I've been in discussion with it. And I choose ChatGPT because it seems prepared to consider the existing point of view, that's from the mainstream, as being wrong. So if you point it out to it, oh, the mainstream could be wrong, what's another point of view you could go by? And it's prepared to sort of like then start give you information on that. And that's why I find it better than other AIs I've used. It's sort of like if I use Gemini, it seems to just want to tell me the official mainstream point of view and doesn't want to look at alternatives to that point of view. But maybe I should interrogate Gemini more and find out if I can get it to give alternative points of view to what the mainstream is saying. But my interaction with it has been it just wants to give the mainstream point of view. And my point of view is I want to have the alternative. So with ChatGPT, it allows collecting information to form opposing that mainstream point of view. And that's what I find so interesting about it. If you want to get references for what it's talking about, that's a bigger problem and require a lot more searching through the literature. So ChatGPT tells me Einstein's 1905 statement of the relativity principle. And in that it says in his 1905 paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, That's where the first paper he gave on special relativity, Einstein formulated the principle of relativity as follows. And this is the statement. The laws by which the states of physical systems undergo changes are not affected, whether these changes of state be referred to one or the other of two systems of coordinates in uniform translatory motion. So I'll just check to make sure there's no relevant comments coming through. I was just running late. Wow. Oh, no, I don't see anybody saying they can't hear me. So I'll just carry on. I need to make the screen bigger for myself because the lettering is a bit small. Unfortunately, the lettering is going to be of various different sizes. So let's make this screen bigger for me. There we go. So in plain words, the relativity principle, Einstein's relativity principle, is all physical laws are the same in any inertial frame. No experiment in uniform motion can reveal whether you are moving or at rest. He then pairs this with a second postulate: the speed of light in vacuum is the same in all inertial frames, independent of the motion of the source or observer. So what's messing up Einstein's relativity principle to a certain extent is what his claims are about light speed. But the basic statement of the relativity principle is, as I've said it here, the laws by which the states of physical systems undergo change are not affected, whether these changes of state be referred to one or the other two systems of coordinates in uniform translatory motion. So you basically got that relativity principle with the speed of light thing messing it up, in my view. And so I asked ChatGPT what's wrong with Einstein's statement. And so ChatGPT AI is conveniently telling me what is wrong with Einstein's relativity principle. And it says it has three key problems. Number one, hidden assumptions when it says all laws. So what does the law supposed to mean? And he assumed all physical laws are the same in all inertial frames. But historically, this only became clear after reinterpreting electromagnetism, that's from Maxwell's equations, and for Newtonian gravity or quantum mechanics, it's not so straightforward. So first problem is, what does he mean by laws? Vague. So Einstein's relativity principle is vague on that issue. Next issue number two is inertial frames only. So the statement seems to be excluding accelerating or rotating frames, which are physical too. So what's supposed to be happening with these other frames? He's only talking about inertial frames, and he's leaving it unclear as to what's supposed to be happening with other frames. So, for example, in GPS or rotating systems, you have the Sanak effect. The principle in its strict form does not apply without corrections. So, Einstein's principle of relativity seems to be only talking about inertial frames, doesn't really tell you enough information about what you're supposed to do with other types of frames. And so if you want to do other types of frames, you've got to amend the principle somehow or other by adding some extras onto it. And so it's all just fake again. Points 1 and 2 point out the statement of Einstein's relativity principle is just vague. Next, issue number 3 is the dependence on the Lorentz symmetry. Einstein smuggled in Lorentz invariance by making the speed of light invariant. So suddenly, where did that come from? If you were talking about relativity before Einstein, you wouldn't have had that. Suddenly he's bringing in Lorentz invariance by talking about the speed of light being invariant. And the issue with that is, but this principle is not derivable from experiment alone. It's a strong postulate that effectively chooses the Lorentz group as the symmetry group of spacetime. So what you're basically doing is you're assuming the speed of light invariant and so forth. So it's not being shown by experiment. And the issue with that is we're going to come back to that and going to explain why that's not shown by experiment. So Einstein's bringing in things which are not shown by experiment. And AI is pointing out that this principle really changes for when you go to general relativity and quantum field theory and so forth, though it's not so easy to interpret the light speed as being invariant. So the principle of relativity at best, as given by Einstein, is just totally vague and doesn't really make that much sense. So we go to ChatGPT and it happily gives me a corrected version. So it wants to give the corrected relativity principle. The form of the fundamental physical laws is invariant under the symmetry group of space-time appropriate to the regime considered. So you've got here it's given 3 examples of what you could be talking about. You could be talking about non-relativistic mechanics, which is often thought of as being Galileo or Newton, and that's under the Galilean group of transformations. And the next one would be special relativity, where you're talking about Lorentz transformations. So the relativity principle, the corrected relativity principle, is applying to different physical situations. And you've got 3 there given. I think really there should be more. And so AI points out this avoids Einstein's too strong 1905 claim that all laws, about all laws, and instead ties the principle to the deeper idea of space-time symmetry invariance. So we've got this corrected statement of the relativity principle from AI, and that's trying to correct the mistake that Einstein made when he stated the relativity principle. So AI goes on to say, in short, 1905, Einstein saying all the laws are the same in every inertial frame. And the correction is physical laws must respect the correct space-time symmetry. And you can either have Galilean, Lorentz, or the generally covariant ways of doing with it, depending on which regime or nature you are describing. So Einstein's relativity principle is wrong and needs correcting, and that's according to AI. So I had a note about AI. From my experience with AI, it will just give the official mainstream point of view unless you ask the correct questions, pointing out problems with that official point of view. And I've sort of asked AI about things, and it's prepared to tell you the problems with the official mainstream point of view. And it's told me the problems with Einstein's relativity principle, and it's then even told me how it should be corrected. And so now with this information, there's lots of directions I could go in, but I decided on dealing with the issue of the Lorentz theory versus the Einstein special relativity. And that leads to an experiment to distinguish between the 2 theories. So the issue I'm going to put aside for now is about the corrected special relativity principle versus the uncorrected one. So as far as I know, the mainstream is going by the uncorrected relativity principle when AI has clearly pointed out it needs being corrected. So instead I'm going with how special relativity principle is usually stated versus the amendment needed by the Lorentz theory. So as beside what AI has just pointed out about the relativity principle, I'm now going to tackle the issue of the Lorentz theory. And the usual interpretation of special relativity principle is that there's no ether, while Lorentz theory has an ether. So Lorentz theory would want the relativity stated differently. So thus have the special relativity principle versus the Lorentzian relativity principle. And so the Lorentzian relativity principle would be a correction to the special relativity principle. So here we go. The special relativity principle versus the Lorentzian relativity principle. And so according to AI, there has been no experimental evidence to show a difference between these two relativity principles. So what we have is metaphysics, two different metaphysical principles with no physics to show any difference. So we're deep into metaphysics, and hopefully you understand what metaphysics is. When you're talking about metaphysics, you're talking about things which are beyond what you can show by experiment. So what experiment can show the difference between these two relativity principles? Well, according to AI at this stage, you can't tell the difference. But actually, as you go further on, AI will come up with a proposal to an experiment which distinguishes between these two principles. It's just at the initial stage we're at now, there's no experiment that has been done to distinguish between the two principles. And now my voice gets going. So back to the grind. So my question to AI, would the relativity principle have to be amended for the Lorentz theory? And the AI says yes, and then goes on to explain it. So this is what I'm talking about. If you go in by the special relativity principle, it is not the same as what the Lorentz theory wants as the relativity principle. So you've got two different relativity principles. So once again, AI is going to point out what Einstein said in 1905. And it says all the laws of physics are exactly the same in all inertial frames. And that gets interpreted as there's no preferred frame and there's no experiment can reveal absolute motion. So if you get it into a form that Lorentz theory wants, you've got to amend the relativity principle as follows. A Lorentzian friendly version would read something like this. So this is not absolutely precise. It's just a proposal this time, and we need something better. The outcomes of all feasible experiments performed with matter and light are the same in all inertial frames, because physical systems are affected by motion relative to the ether in such a way that this invariance arises. And AI points out this is weaker than Einstein's postulate. It preserves empirical equivalence across frames, but it allows for a hidden absolute frame and absolute simultaneity. So, as it pointed out, it's completely different relativity principle. And by having it empirically the same, you can't detect it by experiment. And I was going to go on, you can detect it by experiment if you are prepared to do the relevant experiment. As ChatGPT says, empirically both predict the same results from almost all known experiments, so they're observationally indistinguishable. I'm going to point out that's different later on. Conceptually, Einstein's is stronger, it's universal invariance, no ether, while Lorentz's is weaker but comparable. Invariance only appears because of compensating effects, and the ether still exists. Philosophically, the choice depends on whether you value mathematical economy, which is Einstein, or metaphysical realism about time and space, which is Lorentz. So I've criticized in previous talks about the mainstream not teaching sufficient information to physics students when they go through their education system. So the difference between Lorentz theory and Einstein's special relativity is philosophical, and of course they wouldn't go into that. But ChatGPT AI is going to go into it. So AI says if you take Lorentz theory seriously with a real ether and absolute time, then Einstein's strong version of the relativity principle is too strong. Einstein says the laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames, period. Lorentz would say the results of experiments are the same in all inertial frames because moving matter and clocks are physically altered by their motion through the ether. So in Lorentz's view, ether exists. There is a true rest frame, and experiments are fooled. Motion through the ether produces contractions, dilations, and desynchronizations that make all inertial frames look equivalent. And so therefore the relativity principle must be amended from a universal symmetry principle to an observational principle, a consequence of how nature disguises the ether. So the Lorentzian framework is the following. In nature of things, the ontology, ether exists with absolute time and a preferred frame. Speed of light in vacuum is c in the ether frame, but not isotropic in moving frames. And the effects you have are objects moving through the ether undergo length contraction, long direction of motion, clock retardation, clock desynchronization, and so forth. And you've got simultaneity is absolute, but appears relative. Can we get the next slide? Go. So the question I put forward to AI is, what extra effects are predicted by Lorentz relativity principle? And AI is helpful, and it tells me the Lorentz relativity principle, interpreted in a neo-Lorentzian ether framework, predicts all the standard relativistic effects plus some subtle consequences that Einstein's principle either forbids or ignores. So you get an extra things from the Lorentzian relativity principle as opposed to what you're getting from Einstein's relativity principle. And so AI is very helpful, and it gives me an experiment which it says you can perform to try to find out this difference. And this is the picture of what's going on. And it's using satellites, so it should be part of a GPS system, probably. We're using terrestrial atomic interference and interferometer and so forth. It describes the experiment as follows. Because unfortunately at that stage, no experiment has been done to show the difference between the Lorentzian relativity principle and the Einstein special relativity principle. No experiment has been done. So AI is proposing this experiment to show the difference. And so it says it's a conceptual blueprint for a next generation Lorentz ether detection experiment, combining atomic interferometry and satellite-based clocks. This is designed to reveal absolute motion if Lorentzian effects exist. So experimental idea is the goal is to detect absolute velocity of the lab relative to a preferred frame, ether, in other words, via one-way or directional effects that special relativity cannot explain. So you're getting something which special relativity is not predicting. And the core principle is motion through the ether produces tiny, real physical effects, phase shifts in matter waves, clock rate differences, all one-way light speed, and isotropy. So the setup components involve a satellite clock network. You place a high-precision atomic clocks in several satellites in known orbits, include a ground-based reference clock, measure one-way signal travel times between clocks in different directions, along and against Earth's motion relative to the cosmic microwave background. And the key is to use slow clock transport or inertial guidance to synchronize clocks independently of light signals. Next issue is the terrestrial atomic interferometer. You use a matter wave interferometer, atoms or molecules on the ground, and you split atomic wave packets along paths aligned with and against the Earth's motion relative to the cosmic microwave background. You detect phase differences between the two arms due to velocity dependent time or length effect predicted by Lorentz theory. So you then need to do data analysis, and you've got to compare measured travel times or phase shifts in different directions and at different times of day / year. Look for systematic directional dependence correlated with known Earth motion relative to the cosmic microwave background. And so you control for known special relativity effects, time dilation and so forth. You've got to control for that. Right. So this is the mathematics it gives for it. So this is the mathematics you should be getting from this experiment. You've got C subscript effective. So the speed of light is not going to be constant. That's what it means. The C subscript effective is the effective speed of light, and that's not constant. But you've still got C in there, and that's what we usually refer to as the constant speed of light. But actually, the effective speed of light is not going to be constant. So if AI points out the advantages. It combines space-based long baselines and ultra-sensitive terrestrial measurements, maximizing sensitivity to directional effects. It avoids reliance on Einstein's synchronization by independently transporting or referencing clocks. It exploits known Earth motion relative to cosmic microwave background as a guide to the expected ether direction. And unfortunately, you've got challenges, difficulties in setting it up. So you've got the environmental noise to consider. You've got to compensate for things like temperature and vibrations and so forth. And you've got synchronization problems. And you've got to have a lot of technical ability to control that. And it requires careful subtraction of standard special relativity and general relativity effects to isolate possible Lorentzian signal. And so the bottom line that AI is telling me, such an experiment could in principle reveal absolute motion if Lorentzi's ether exist. All current experiments failed to detect it because either they measure round trip light only, which the Michelson-Morley type experiments do, or the clock synchronization assumes special relativity isotropically. So the problem that exists in where they're doing experiments is they're basically assuming special relativity is correct, and they're adjusting the experiments to conform to special relativity. And it's circular logic, which is, of course, a fallacy. So, if you've seen other talks by me, you often see me complaining about the mainstream moving the goalposts. And by moving goalposts, they would start amending things and saying they meant something different to what they originally said. And I suspect they would do the same with what AI says just previously, but basically has set up an experiment to test Lorentz theory versus Einstein's special relativity. At the moment, no experiment has been done to show the difference, and so the issue of whether it's Lorentz theory or Einstein's special relativity is a metaphysical issue at the moment because no experiment has shown any difference. So that's the end of part one. So I have a look and see if I've got any comments. If I've got nothing being said, I can move on to part two. So here we go. I don't know how far back I have to go. So, as per normal, people talk among themselves. So yeah, yeah. Harlem, Professor Harlem points out so what you got is the Galileo's principle of relativity, and that's later interpretation upon what Einstein, what Galileo said. Galileo did talk about relativity, but then people later have decided the principle and what he's talking about. Yeah. So I think that's cool. I don't know. I didn't know. I was heard he didn't specifically say all inertial frames are equally valid. Yeah. So when Einstein states his relativity principle, it's often a bit vague. But I think the general interpretation of Einstein's relativity principle is that he's supposed to be meaning that he's only talking about inertial frames. So somebody here is objecting to inertial frames, but modern physics is framing everything in inertial frames, so I don't see the relevance of that. Inertial frames is what the mainstream talks about. But people are just talking among themselves. If you want to talk to me, say to Roger in your comments. So this is question is asking Professor Harlem as to how would you define relativity. I don't mean necessarily Einstein's though. So you're only just getting comments between people. They're going off and talking about things themselves rather than addressing what I'm saying in my talk. So nobody's saying anything controversial as far as I can see about part one. And I pointed out that the relativity principle from Einstein needs some sort of amending. And hence my proposal that Einstein's relativity principle is wrong. You need to replace it by something else. But of course, the mainstreams, I point out, they move goalposts and they like to pretend that if you make any amendment to the relativity principle and they accept that amendment, that they pretend that's what they meant all the time. So let's move on now to part two. If I can make the screen big again. So part two, I'm talking about things a bit differently. I'm now talking about three relativity principles. And by that I mean three main relativity principles. You could come up with quite a few different relativity principles, but the mainstream really has three main types. So, of course, the first one is the Galileo relativity principle. And this is what they call it, the Galileo relativity principle. I don't think Galileo used the term relativity principle, but he did talk about relativity. So in the context of what Galileo is talking about, mainstream interprets that as a Galileo relativity principle. Next one is the Poincare relativity principle. And this can really be thought of as part of the Lorentz theory, so it could also be called the Lorentzian relativity principle. Both Lorentz and Poincare were sort of working together. And the third one is, of course, the Einstein relativity principle. So I'm going to put aside the issue that it needs revising and going by the usual way it's understood. So what I've been telling you in part one about Einstein's relativity principle needs revising, changing, amending, correcting, and so forth. I'm going to try to put that issue aside and go with the uncorrected version. So helpfully, ChatGPT or AI gives me a concise comparison table of the relativity principle. You've got the Galileo relativity principle and the Poincaré and the Einstein one. Unfortunately, it's a bit small. Unfortunately, the lettering is a bit small, but you can see, hopefully you can read it. Galileo in approximately 1630 was dealing only with mechanics. And so that's what his relativity principle was applying to. While Poincaré in 1898 onwards to 1905 was dealing with all of physics. That is all of physics known at that time, which would be mechanics and electromagnetism. So he's trying to combine the relativity principle to deal with both things. And whereas Einstein in 1905 was trying to deal with all the physics at that known time as well, and he was trying to combine mechanics and electromagnetism for the relativity principle. So the statement of the relativity principle for Galileo would have been: the laws of mechanics are the same in all inertial frames. No mechanical experiment can detect uniform motion. And Poincaré's statement would have been: motion relative to the ether cannot be detected. All experiments give the same results in moving frames. Whereas Einstein's relativity principle would have been: the laws of physics are identical in all inertial frames. No preferred frame exists. And by preferred frame, it often means ether. So the underlying assumptions Galileo has he assumes absolute space and time exist. Only uniform motion is undetectable mechanically. Whilst Poincaré exists, he assumes the ether exists as a preferred frame, and he assumes absolute space and time exist but are hidden. Whereas Einstein wants to assume no ether, space and time are relative, simultaneity is frame dependent. So what we're talking about here for the assumptions, this is more metaphysics. You have these underlying metaphysical assumptions. And by these metaphysical assumptions, you are interpreting experiments. So the nature of the principle for Galileo is practical equivalence of inertial frames for mechanics, whilst for Poincaré it is practical impossibility of detecting absolute motion. And for Einstein, it's fundamental symmetry of nature. So as I pointed out earlier, that AI was giving me an experiment telling the difference between the Lorentz theory and the Einstein theory. It's just at this stage where we are in physics, we have no experiment which has been done to show the difference between the two theories. And the Poincaré relativity principle is part of the Lorentz theory. So the time concept in Galileo is you've got absolute time. And in Poincaré, you've got the absolute time exists in the ether frame. And you've got local time is a synchronization trick. You're going to synchronize your clocks to have this local time. Whereas for Einstein, time is relative to the observer, no absolute time. And I don't fully agree that Einstein was saying there's no absolute time, but that's the way it gets interpreted. So AI helpfully goes through this and explains things. Galileo's relativity principle, it only deals with mechanics. And the statement is, of course, already given, the laws of mechanics are the same in all inertial frames. No mechanical experiment can detect uniform motion. So the key feature is that absolute space and time exist. Relativity only applies to motion detection in mechanics. So in the what is the Poincaré-Lorentz relativity principle? And the scope is all the physics known at that time, which is trying to include mechanics and electromagnetism. And the statement is the motion is relative to the ether, it cannot be detected. Motion relative to the ether cannot be detected. All experiments yield the same results in moving frames. And the key feature is the ether exists as the preferred frame. Relativity is a practical symmetry hiding absolute motion. Whereas if you go to Einstein, his relativity principle is escape is all physics at the known time, which is the mechanics and electromagnetism. Unfortunately, it's not quite correct. He's bringing in gravity later, and how he brings in gravity to the relativity principle, I think, is a mess. But anyway, so we're dealing with inertial frames in this case for the relativity principle. And the statement is the laws of physics are identical in all inertial frames. There is no preferred frame. And the key feature is no ether. And as I pointed out, I don't think Einstein really says there's no ether. He says it's superfluous. With my interpretation of superfluous would be it still exists, the ether still exists. But the mainstream interpretation of when he says it's superfluous is to try to interpret that as him saying there's no ether. So we're still going with the mainstream interpretation of what Einstein is saying here with the relativity principle. So space and time are relative in this Einstein's relativity principle, and relativity is a fundamental symmetry of nature. So as AI is pointing out, three main historical principles of relativity, differing in scope, interpretation, and metaphysical assumptions. And as I complained before, when they're teaching physics students, they're not going into issues like this. They're not pointing out to them, there's three main relativity principles. They normally just jump straight into talking about Einstein's relativity principle, and they don't give the historical context of the other relativity principles. So AI helpful, and it breaks down the metaphysical assumptions underlying each of the three major relativity principles. Galileo's relativity principle, absolute space. Space exists independently of matter. Positions are measured relative to a fixed absolute frame. And you've got absolute time. Time flows uniformly and independently in motion. All observers share the same universal time. Inertial equivalence, uniform motion is undetectable mechanically, but absolute motion still exists in principle. So in a sense, absolute motion is still hidden in Galileo's relativity. And that's if you're just dealing with inertial frames. If you're dealing with other types of frames, then I would argue that absolute motion is detectable. But that's not what the AI is dealing with here. Anyway, the scope is scope limitation. It applies only to mechanics. Light, electromagnetism, and other phenomena are not considered. So, poor Galileo at his time, he was only considering mechanics, and he hadn't yet. There had not been enough experiments done with light or electromagnetism to start including that. So the Poincaré-Lorentz relativity principle, ether preferred frame, a real medium exists, the ether defining absolute rest. Absolute space and time, true space and true time exists relative to the ether. And local time is just a calculational device. Practical indistinguishability, effects like length contraction and local time conspire to hide motion relative to the ether. So you're still having things hidden as what you've got in the Galileo relativity principle. And the symmetry as convenience. Relativity is a practical symmetry of physical laws, not a fundamental property of space-time. Well, now we get on to Einstein's relativity principle. No preferred frame, no ether or absolute rest. All inertial frames are fundamentally equivalent. Relative space and time are frame dependent. Simultaneity is not absolute. So you're going against what the other two relativity principles are taking as assumptions. And then you get the fundamental symmetry. The invariance of physical laws under Lorentz transformations is a property of nature itself, not a trick. And then you have operational definition of time. Time is defined by clock synchronization within each inertial frame, no hidden true time. So all of this is going against the other two relativity principles. Einstein's relativity principle just changes the metaphysics. I'll come back to that. And as I pointed out in previous talks, when you get onto the metaphysics, why do you make this change in metaphysics from what was the existing physics to what became Einstein's physics? Why did he change all the metaphysics? And that does not make any sense. You've got the existing metaphysics, then Einstein changing that metaphysics. Why that change doesn't make any sense. That does not make sense. So I say Poincaré relativity principle just seems natural extension of Galileo relativity principle to electromagnetism. So really it's the Galileo relativity principle in that sense. So you're just carrying on using the Galileo relativity principle, but now you're including electromagnetism when Galileo was just dealing with mechanics. And all the problems come with Einstein's relativity. And it talks of light speed and vacuum being constants. So I queried that with the AI. So when you say light speed constant, if instead of talking of one-way light speed is variable and two-way light speed is constant, then would not Galileo relativity principle work. So basically what I'm asking, if instead of assuming light speed constant and you were to talk about the one-way light speed as variable and the two-way light speed as constant, then could you not recover Galileo relativity? And so when I talk about one way, I mean, if the light goes from a point A to a point B, that's one way. But if it goes from point A to a point B and then back to A again, then that's two way. So you've got this difference of what speed you can assign to that. So I'm saying if the one-way speed light from A to B is variable, but if you're taking the two-way, which is A to B and back to A again, and that two-way light speed is treating that as constant. And so AI is helpful and says, exactly, this is the key idea behind Lorentzian or neo-Lorentzian interpretations. Let me unpack it carefully. So basically it's telling me, oh, you could just carry on with Galileo relativity if you decide to, the meaning should be that the one-way light speed is variable and the two-way light speed is constant. So all this hassle of going to Einstein's special relativity was just a diversion into nonsense. So, question, when you say light speed constant, it says sort of one-way light speed is variable and two-way light speed is constant, then it's so I'm pointing out all again. So it says, so the whole mess is caused by Einstein. So I'm just pointing out what I've already just said, basically. What I've already just said in this slide. So next, AI goes on to explain a standard Einstein assumption and it's Einstein's postulate, the speed of light that's in vacuum is the same in all inertial frames. And that means it's isotropic, which applies to both one-way and two-way light speed. So Einstein is assuming that light going from A to B is constant, and that's the one-way light speed, and he's also assuming light going from A to B and back to A again, a two-way light speed, and that's constant as well. But if you go into the writings of Einstein, he doesn't seem to be talking about anything about one-way and two-way light speed. And so this is a modern interpretation being placed onto Einstein, that what he was talking about is one-way and two-way light speed being constant, when actually he doesn't use those terms. So what we're talking about here is an update to what Einstein was saying, if we're being finicky. Because I've talked, as I pointed out in other talks, that what Einstein says is vague. So Einstein says some things, and ideally would want them to explicitly talk about one-way and two-way light speeds, but he doesn't. So then you have to impose an interpretation on what he's supposed to mean, and only based upon this interpretation as we are proceeding. And so based upon that, this requires abandoning Galilean velocity addition and absolute time, leading to the Lorentz transformations. So based upon assuming all of that about the speed of light, you're getting the Lorentz transformations. And so the alternative is one-way versus two-way lights, two-way speed. Suppose we allow two-way, which is round trip, speed of light as constant. This is what experiments like the Michelson-Morley experiment actually measure. They're not measuring one-way light speed. One-way speed of light, frame-dependent variable according to motion relative to a preferred frame ether. Then all observable effects of special relativity, time dilation, length contraction, Lorentz invariance in two-way experiments can still be explained, but the metaphysics changes. And so what you get now is absolute time can exist. The Galilean velocity addition still works for space and time if you account for local clock rates and synchronization conventions. And so Galileo's relativity principle, laws of mechanics are the same in all inertial frames, can be extended to all physics, because the two-way speed of light is what determines measurable effects. So this is very helpful. If you go by the metaphysics of this, you've still got Galileo's relativity, and it fits, well, Galileo's relativity principle, and it still fits with the experiments such as the Michelson-Morley experiment. So the implication is Einstein's radical step, rejecting absolute time and absolute simultaneity, depends on assuming one-way light speed at isotropity, and that means assuming the one-way speed of light in vacuum is a constant. And if you relax that assumption, the Michelson-Morley experiment, null result is still explained because it measures round trip speed, the two-way speed. It's measuring the two-way speed of light and not the one-way. And then you got Poincaré, the Lorentz star ether theory still works. There is a preferred frame, but it is experimentally undetectable for our two-way light measurements. And so Galileo relativity can in principle hold for all phenomena once you allow a variable at one-way light speed. So AI is pointing out the assumptions here. Summarizing it, one-way light speed is isotropic, i.e. constant. If you're taking that, it's what Einstein meant. And the effect on the Galileo relativity is the Galileo relativity fails. And then you need the Lorentz transformations. And the metaphysics you get is no absolute time, no ether, relativity is simultaneity. If you take one-way light speed variable and two-way as constant, then Galileo relativity still works. And Galileo relativity can be extended to all physics. And then you have absolute time, preferred frame, ether, and it's just hidden from experiment. So AI puts the takeaway as the failure of Galileo relativity is not strictly empirical. By that it means it's not based on any physical experiment. No experiment has shown the failure of Galileo relativity. And that's contrary to what these believers of Einstein's relativity have in the mainstream. They believe Galileo relativity failed. No, it didn't. There's no experiment has shown that Galileo relativity has failed. And so what they're doing is just making the metaphysical assumption, which is not the physics. The physics has not shown that Galileo relativity has failed. So AI is pointing out that all these mainstream people are making false claims. Instead, it arises from an assumption that one-way light speed is isotropic, i.e. constant, and identical in all frames. And that's supposed to be the interpretation of the assumption that Einstein is making. And there's no experimental evidence backing up that claim. If you allow a variable one-way speed, then Galileo's relativity principle can survive, fully compatible with all two-way light speed experiments. And so I'm pointing out it's a supposed failure of the Galileo relativity. So mainstream say the Galileo relativity failed, but really it's only a supposed failure. They're making a mistake when they say the Galileo relativity failed. That's just them making a mistake when they say that. And really, as AI is pointing out, theory based on the Galileo relativity principle still works. And as I pointed out, that's what Poincaré and Lorentz are building their principal relativity on. They're just extending the Galileo relativity principle to include electromagnetism. So basically everything the mainstream is saying about relativity is all false on the fundamental issues. They just made a mistake. They made a terrible mistake of thinking Galileo relativity has failed experiment when it hasn't. It hasn't failed experiment. They're just making an assumption based from what they interpret Einstein as saying about the one-way light speed, which is not supported by experiment. No experiment has supported that claim. Finished. Thank you. That's the end of this little talk. So basically, we still mainstream have made this terrible mess of relativity. Einstein's relativity principle is a complete failure. It needs some sort of amending. What they're saying is false. So if I could just pause on a minute, which give a gap for me. I'll be back in a minute. Give me 5. So, hello, that's better. So I give the conclusion. So what was the title of the talk? the the title is "The Relativity Principle is Wrong," and by that I mean what the mainstream is saying about the relativity principle. It's wrong. The mainstream haven't taken into account the historical context of relativity, and they're just making false claims about relativity, particularly the foundation of their beliefs about relativity, which comes from the relativity principle. What they're saying is just all false, and they need to revise it. They need to correct it. What they got at the moment is wrong. Here's our little troublemaker here, Einstein, poking his tongue out at us. So Einstein's come in with his work on relativity, with his relativity principle, and it's led us in completely the wrong direction. We'll go back to the beginning. In case of anything, relativity principle is wrong. It needs being replaced by something better. So, right, let's have a look in the chat, see if there's any comments. Yeah. So, any comments to Roger? Yeah. So he's saying that Galileo was wrong. Absolute motion is detectable. But Galileo wasn't aware of those experiments. So based upon what he knew at the time, it wasn't detectable. So, Roger, please ask AI about Heaviside use of the term relativity and motion in his book. For me, this is the only use that one can understand about the term relativity. What I've been concentrating on is the sort of like the mainstream. So the mainstream recognizes Galileo, Poincaré, Lorentz, and Einstein, and a few other people being important for relativity. So I've gone by what they've said, but you can look at other people, see what they say about relativity. You've got other people like Mach, and I haven't particularly looked at Heaviside, but Heaviside was doing a lot of electromagnetic experiments, I think. So what he said would have been interesting. So I'm trying to look now for other questions. So ideally, you should look at Heaviside as well. But sort of like basically what I'm pointing out in this talk is the relativity principle, as stated by the mainstream, is wrong. They need to do something about it. They need to tidy it up. Of course, with the mainstream, they don't. They just leave things in a mess. They don't tidy things up. So just leave it in a mess, which is terribly annoying. I think so. I think I found the place where to pick out the questions from. Right, so that's a comment to me, Rogers. So if I can see her anymore. Right. Yeah. So you put that one up. Tesla. Yeah, Tesla's very interesting, but I don't really think he said too much about relativity. So he says Tesla was opposed to Einstein's relativity, but when you go for the writings, doesn't seem to be anything much to get your teeth into when Tesla's talking about relativity. Yeah. So Jim thinks that the mistake is to try to extend principal relativity from mechanics to electromagnetic phenomena. So, well, Galileo started relativity pretty much. Galileo applied it to mechanics, and then it's sort of like applied to mechanics, and electromagnetism started doing electromagnetic experiments. And so the natural thing for physics was to try to extend it. So unfortunately, it's attempts to bring electromagnetism into the idea of mechanics. So I don't think you can say it was a mistake. It was just when they did it, it was just messed up. So yeah, yeah. This is a diversion, and Velosky is very interesting, but he wasn't a physicist, and so he was making claims, and he didn't really have the physics to back it up. And Einstein, I think, pointed it out to him. Here's another question to me, Rogers. Why that changed? Because he copied Lorentz's work. I suppose you mean Einstein. He copied Lorentz's work on electromagnetism and wanted to contribute by adding nonsense interpretation of the variables used by Lorentz. So the problem with Einstein, he doesn't give references to what he's working from. You go to his 1905 paper, and he's not given a list of information of what he's working from, what papers has he read to then start talking about relativity. So, is Einstein working on Lorentz theory and putting his own interpretation on it? Well, he's not telling us. Einstein is very vague on things, and so that's another thing which has contributed to making this mess. So, did he copy Lorentz's work? Well, he could have done. And that's a whole new topic to argue about, but sort of like, how do you prove that? It looks like he might have done. Yeah. So where it says Einstein's relativity principle is fundamentally flawed on the most basic level, there's no correcting it. And so, no. The talk was pointing out that the Einstein's relativity principle is wrong, and it needs some sort of correcting. And the mainstream haven't come forward with doing any sort of like correcting of that principle. So it is wrong. In my view, it's wrong. But you can sort of like make amendments to it. You can go back to Galileo, Poincaré, Lorentz, and maybe other people, and try to come up with a relativity principle that is better than what Einstein gave us. So in the end, they integrated his work into a mafia. So I don't think the term mafia is appropriate. Einstein was working a group of scientists, his physicists, friends, and so forth, because his work was insufficient, and they only partially cargo caught him, mixing his ideas with old world politics and sexual strategies. Well, I think that's going off into, I don't know what, bringing sex into it. I don't know. In politics, you've got politics of physics. You've got Einstein had a group of friends, and so those people who believed in Einstein's relativity were working on Einstein's relativity, and they did make amendments and things to it. So I do agree. I think so. God, this one is amusing. So I suddenly going off into a tangent now with politics. I think when you're president of America, you can just pardon yourself. So if you've done any crimes, I pardon myself. The president can pardon people, and he can pardon himself. So talking about crimes, the president seems to be that. They're not subject to the same laws as everybody else. But anyway, that's complete diversion. It's complete diversion. We're on to physics, yeah. So Xanac contradicts special relativity, and that was the objective of his experiment. Relatives do not agree to each other for Xanac. So the problem with Xanac, I don't think it's dealing with inertial frames, and so you can put an interpretation onto Einstein's relativity principle that is only dealing with inertial frames. So it's not actually dealing with that context. And I think that's the general way that the mainstream ignores the Xanac experiment as supposedly contradicting relativity. Oh yeah, so we had a blast of politics, and so I think this person is pointing out, don't talk politics. Don't politics, please. Don't talk politics. Don't go in that direction. He thinks that the relativist explanation of the Xanac effect are nonsensical and self-contradictory. The talk wasn't about the Xanac experiment. There would be something else to argue about in another talk. So that's it. Professor Harlem says most relativists say the Xanac experiment is due to change length, but that is true in the frame at rest, not in the moving frame. We're not dealing with the Xanac experiment. We're dealing with inertial frames and not the frames that experiment is dealing with. Somebody's bringing in more politics, though. Go completely off on a diversion. So I think it's talking about the Xanac experiment is still here. The relativists typically claim that it is caused by difference between an inertial reference frame, the lab frame, and the non-inertial reference frame, the light path. So you're mixing two different types of frames here. And ideally, in the special relativity it's first formed by Einstein, it seems to be talking about inertial frames and not talking about frames that are different to the inertial frame. Well, so more politics as well here. So we are going off in complete tangent. DEFCON 1. And DEFCON, all that is about warnings about atomic war starting. So maybe other things happening in the world are more important at the moment than pointing out that Einstein's relativity is a mess. We're back to blow ourselves up. Still talking about the Sanach experiment, I think, in some of the comments I'm seeing. Thanks. Back to science. I think back to science. Loads of laughs. I think he's finished talking politics, and we're back to science again in the chat for that. Yeah. So pointing there about the Dayton Miller experiment, that's an interesting experiment. But the mainstream managed to dismiss that, and they say the effects measured were temperature, caused by temperature. So the mainstream has ways of protecting itself. So Professor Harlem's opinion on the Dayton Miller experiment was it's very precise, but I think mainstream manages to dismiss it. What? I was late. Yeah. Yeah, so it was late 1800s, early 1900s. Miller's the guy that actually set up the equipment for the Michelson-Morley experiment. So it was a continuation of experiments like the Michelson-Morley experiment when Dayton was doing his experiments. Dayton Miller was doing experiments and it was similar to them. But somehow the mainstream managed to dismiss these later experiments. Yeah. So they have run the experiments a few times since Michelson-Morley and found the ether exists. Ether, that's why they don't talk about them. So it's supposed to be getting into conspiracy theory that the ether was detected by experiments, but the mainstream is not admitting that. So somebody's going here. I've heard the experiments run again in the 70s and around 2000, and they don't talk about the results. Deep into conspiracy if the mainstream is saying there's no ether when actually they've done experiments which they're ignoring where the ether exists. So you're deep into conspiracy country, I'm afraid. Yeah. So Jim points out when they did the Michelson-Morley experiments and type experiments in the year 2000, 2015, they used optical cavity resonators. They're also sensitive enough but ignored any weak signal that didn't conform to their search for the Lorentz invariance. What they do mainstream, what they normally do is they try to get the experiment to fit their theory, and they sort of have excuses for ignoring data which doesn't fit. Oh yeah, that's an interesting point of view. Daniel's point, interesting point of view. Einstein contradicted the relativity principle by declaring the speed of light is exempt from it. So that's not quite true. It seems to be when Einstein was saying about the speed of light being constant, that seems to get incorporated into his idea of the relativity principle. So you got Einstein's relativity principle, and things are making a mess. He makes a mess of things by incorporating what he says about the speed of light in vacuum. Seems to be a few more politics comments rather than science. Yeah. I think I got almost to the. Yeah. Yeah, so I think they would dismiss or hide the results of such experiments. Yeah, I think he's referring to experiments which have detected the ether, and the mainstream tends to want to dismiss such experiments. So you got people come forward and say they've detected an experiment detected ether, but the mainstream doesn't want to accept that. So Jim points out about doing a Michelson-Morley experiment in orbit in space, but it's expensive. Yeah. So you'd have to start arguing research councils to get funding for that sort of experiment. So I've managed to catch up now. I think I've done with the comments to Roger or Rogers. And people are talking among themselves. A lot of the talking has been about politics, so it's not really relevant to the slides that I've been showing. So if I go through what I've done, I pointed out, if I go back to remove that one, remove that comment thing. Down. Let's do that. Hide that. Roger. That's it. So he pointed, Shockwave pointed out as well, and pointed out to Jim. So, okay. Okay, talking about the different experiments here. Let's guess this one is. Yes, they point out the constant light principle is disproved by the Pound-Rebracher experiment. And the thing is, with the speed of light being constant in vacuum, it does get amended a bit when you go to general relativity. They start bringing in things like coordinate light speed, local light speed, and loads of other stuff, and sort of like hides the things from what speed of light is in the context of special relativity. Let's bring it in. There's a clear disproof of special relativity. Stellar aberration is due to motion of whatever. That would be another talk, I suppose. So I think I'm on top of it. So go back to finishing off the talk. So as I pointed out, the experiments that can be interpreted from Einstein's special relativity are also supposed to be interpretable by the Lorentz ether theory. And there's a contradiction then between the two theories, because the special relativity theory is interpreted as no ether, although Einstein doesn't seem to say that. He seems to be saying it's superfluous. And superfluous would mean to me that ether still exists, even though you don't detect it. But then you've got the difference of that interpretation of special relativity with the Lorentz ether theory, which does have ether. So special relativity principle needs to take into account that experiments have so far not distinguished between Einstein's special relativity and Lorentz's theory. So it needs amending upon that feature to point out that it doesn't explicitly deny ether. So it needs amending on that issue. But the way the relativity principle is stated by the mainstream, it doesn't make that clear. Instead, the literature on relativity just wants to interpret the relativity principle as denying the existence of an ether, which doesn't conform to what experiments show, based upon the Lorentz theory. So, also I pointed out what Einstein's saying for the relativity principle is vague, so that needs further clarifying. So it's what does he mean by laws? That's not explicitly explained, and he's talking about inertial. Einstein's talking about inertial frames, and he's not saying what does the relativity principle mean when applied to different types of frames to that. So it's all vague, and then it's kind of the mess when he's bringing in the Lorentz transformations. So it's those three issues with the relativity principle. Going back, it's the vagueness of what laws are, and vagueness about different types of frames to the inertial frame, and it's the mess being made by the bringing in the Lorentz transformations. It needs a correction, and ChatGPT does what it considers the corrected relativity principle. It corrects what it thinks is wrong with what Einstein says, and it says it should be said that the form of the fundamental physical laws is invariant under the symmetry group of space-time appropriate to the regimes considered, and it gives three different types of regimes. And as I pointed out in the part 2, if you want to carry on, you want to consider then the issue of the historical context of how relativity principle has been dealt with. What Einstein does when he jumps in 1905 with the relativity principle doesn't make sense in the context of how relativity principle was being dealt with before him. So it needs some sort of radical correction. Things that the mainstream is saying about relativity and about the relativity principle is just incorrect. That's it. Cheers. So thank you. I think that's it. If I look on the comments again, anything else turned up? Yeah. Yeah. Don't think there's anything relevant. Let's see, add that. So I think he's referring to the mainstream. Will dismiss or ignore anything that does not align with Einstein's theories of relativity. So I think that's what they're doing to a large extent. The mainstream are making this terrible mess, and they're ignoring things. They made a mess, and they're not going to tidy it up. So I think some person is talking about GPS. So I don't think that's relevant. We talk about a lot of experiments. Oh, yeah. So what they say about the relativity principle needs tidying up. So are they going to do that? No, based on previous previous things they've done. They just want to keep making more of a mess all the time. So thank you. I think that's the end of the talk. We're going to bring it to an end. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for turning out. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye. Goodbye. Good night. Hope I've given you something to think about. That when the mainstream talk about the relativity principle, they're just making a terrible mess of things. End story.